designed me to be, right? So when I said I never thought I was better, let me explain to you what that means, right? Because let's correct the definition of better, right? Because sometimes when the world hears better, they think ego, they think comparison, they think hierarchy, right? But spiritually, better is about alignment, refinement, and obedience. That means that I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure each and every day that I am aligning myself with the will of God. And I can't know how to align myself if I don't spend time with Him, right? I'm more intentional to make sure that I'm refining, going through refinement, allowing God to burn off old ways, old desires, old habits, right? So I'm allowing Him to refine me, right? And I'm also becoming more obedient, right? So when I say, what if I became better? I wasn't asking, can I outgrow people? Right. What I was actually asking is, can I outgrow dysfunction? Right. Because how many of you may have come from a family or been in an environment where where it's full of dysfunction? Right. So for me, I was asking, Nadira, can you outgrow dysfunction? Can you outgrow fear-based decisions? Because a lot of the decisions that I used to make, it was based on fear. It was never based on confidence. It was based on, I don't want this, or I don't want this to happen, or I don't want that to happen. So I was asking, when I asked, what if I became better? This is a thought process that I was going through. What if I can outgrow emotional instability, right? Always crying when I felt like somebody said something, I would just immediately just burst into tears, right? Learning how to control my emotions. What if I can outgrow patterns that kept me from repeating cycles that was keeping me in the same place, right? Sometimes we are so eager to grow, and we say we want to grow, we say we want to do this, but we don't change the patterns, right? That keep us in those same places, right? And that's not pride. When you do that, that's not pride. It's responsibility, right? Because at some point, growth becomes a decision. I'm going to say that again. At some point, growth really does become a decision, right? So let me go a little bit deeper than the surface level when it comes to when I say rich woman, poor woman, and I'm talking about the being torn between two mentalities, right? When you think about having a poor mentality, it's not just necessarily about lack, it's about agreement with limitations. And I'm not talking about impossible things, that like unrealistic things. It means you're coming into agreement and you're settling for the limitations that you currently have in your life, not because you're physically limited, it's because it's your mind has limited you based on how you think. And your thinking has a lot to do with sometimes what you've been exposed to, right? It sounds more like, this is just my situation, right? This is just how it always has been, right? Or I don't want people to think that I'm different. And these are some of the things that I would think about, right? When I was talk about that poor mentality. I don't want people to think that I think I'm better than them, or think that I know so much because I started to grow in certain areas. But what this mindset that I had, what it prioritized comfort over calling. So though I knew God was calling me to more, though I knew that that God has called me to do some of the things that I saw with my own eyes as, oh my God, I don't know if I can be able to do that. I started to look at all the insecurities. I started to look at all the things I was not great at. I was starting to look at other people who had more credentials in different areas. But when I look back over my life, the positions that God has always put me in was never because of my credentials. It was just simply because God qualified. You don't have to be qualified to do what He calls you to do. He calls you and then He qualifies you, right? But when I started to really become free, I started to ignore, right? I started to ignore some of the things and patterns that I would start to develop in. I would be like, you know what? No, I'm not a failure. I can talk in a way that people can understand. I just refuse to be defined by whatever I felt my insecurities were, right? Some people may say, well, this is where I am. But just because that's where you are, it doesn't mean that's who you are. So just because you could be in a particular place in your life where you feel like things are not going the way you want them to, that doesn't necessarily mean that defines who you are. And that was one of the things that was like a huge thing for me, because I realized that no matter what I went through, I am not defined by where I live. I am not defined by what I drive. I am not defined by um who's, where, what I have. I'm defined by who God says that I am, right? And I know that sounds a lot easier than it is to actually operate in it, but the more you begin to internalize that, it will eventually start changing the way you see yourself, when you see yourself as God sees you, right? Freedom begins in the mind before it shows up in your life. I'm going to say that again. Freedom begins in the mind before it shows up in your life. I want you to take a minute and think about that. Let's look at Romans chapter 12, verse 2, right? When you look at Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it tells us that we have to renew our mind, right? Because if you're thinking that I can still be who God called me to be without changing or renewing my mind, right? Then what's going to happen is you're going to keep repeating the same things, expecting a different result, but you're doing the same things over and over again, right? And that's what you call insane. That's ludicrous. It doesn't make sense, right? If you want change, real change in your thinking and how you show up in your life, your business, as a parent, then you've got to start, right, by changing the way you think, and not just changing the way you think into anything. And I'm not talking about positive thinking. I'm not talking about, though positive thinking has its advantages, I'm not talking about just being positive, right? I'm talking about really seeing yourself the way God sees you do. In order for that to happen, then you've got to spend time with him and see and understand that when he says his thoughts about you are good and not evil, right? You got to internalize that, because it's not enough for people to tell you that, that God, when people tell you, man, you're better than that. If you don't really truly believe that, then you're going to identify, right? Or you're going to have what I call imposter syndrome. And you're going to say, yeah, I agree, I believe. But then what's happening is your actions is going to demonstrate something different, right? Freedom will cost